long ago, I told you the story of how the Earth came to be. Today, let's hear the story of Earth coming to life with plants and all kinds of animals. Think back to when the Earth was born, just a drop of light and heat, full of commotion and confusion. And in all that, each particle was given a set of laws. The Earth cooled and all settled down according to the laws that governed all things: water, rocks, and the air. The earth was a beautiful little pearl lit up by her mother, the sun. The sun could not stop looking at it. It admired the earth both day and night. One day, the sun saw something was not quite in order. Something was beginning to happen. It rained a lot on this earth. As water passed through the air, it mixed with carbon dioxide gas, and a weak acid was formed. When this acid fell on rocks, it began to dissolve them, breaking them up and allowing mineral salts to escape. Storms also created huge waves, which pounded on the rocks, adding to the problem by breaking up the rocks even more. Water washed all the mineral salts into the sea. The problem was that the sea was becoming full of the mineral salts, and the land was being washed away. It looked like the order that had been created was breaking up. Who was causing this? The sun said to water, "Water, what's going on? You're getting so full of salts and minerals." Water said, "Who, me? What have I done? All that I'm doing is following my laws. When I become hot, I disappear, and when I get cold, I fall down. Since I am a liquid, whenever I see a hollow, I have to enter. Go and talk to air. It's air who stirs me up, then I have to move." So the sun went to air and pointed out that the water was filling with salts and minerals. "Water says you've got something to do with this," sun concluded. Air said, "Me? I like that. I was given the job of covering the earth with layers of blankets. I have to always cover her, and she is so big and has such a cold head and such cold feet. What does water do? Just jumps on my back to take a ride. When the land is flat, I'm fine, but it's too hard climbing mountains. I have to drop her. I'm just obeying my laws. When I am heated, I rise, and when I cool, I sink." "It's the fault of those rocks," Air continued. "They are so full of wrinkles and bubbles, they have no consideration at all. They do not move to let me pass. They get so hot that when I get near them, I have to climb up to avoid burning. When they are freezing, I cringe." "Go and talk to the rocks," Air advised the sun. So the sun moved on to explain the problem to the rocks. The rocks said, "Blame us, will you? We are not doing anything but sitting around. Do you think we want to get hot? The sun shines on us, and we cannot help it. We are made this way. We are obeying our laws. If you ask us, sun, it's your fault. You're the culprit." And so it went on. You see, sun, water, air, and rocks were all at fault. Everything was acting just the way it should, and yet the order was being threatened. Something had to be done. Something else had to be created to help bring order back to the earth. Something was created. A tiny droplet, so tiny it could not be seen. This tiny droplet was given the power to eat and grow and have the ability to create others like itself. And so life came to the earth in little drops of jelly in the water. Like tiny machines, living things began to clean up the sea, eating the mineral salts in the water and building up their bodies. Some built shells around their bodies for protection. When they died, their shells dropped to the floor of the sea with the salts trapped in them. Time passed, and layer upon layer of these tiny shells built up and formed a special kind of mud. They were like the pages of a book. Some of these pages were left for us to read to tell us what happened long, long ago. We know that life follows laws. that allow it to take it wherever it needs from the environment to maintain a balance on the earth. Living things also do not live forever, and so they multiply and make others like themselves to continue the work. Little is known about the beginning of life on earth. We can find out about these times by reading the stories to be found in some of the rocks that cover our planet. Every day, new pages of this book of the history of life on Earth are discovered. Perhaps one day you will read some of these pages yourself. Life began as small particles in the water. Some of them look like this. When the book of the earth opened up its first page, all these tiny creatures were already there, living in the water. Here is the amoeba, a one-celled creature with no shell. Here's another. It's called a flagellate, with two little whips to help it move about. And this creature is made of a group of cells. There was one kind of creature that could be found in these ancient seas in great numbers. They're known as the trilobites. Trilobites were the most advanced creatures of their time, and they grew in many different shapes and sizes. Today, we no longer have these creatures, but they were around for a long time at the beginning of life on Earth. Look, this time is even called the kingdom of trilobites. Time went on, and all kinds of creatures appeared, and all sorts of experiments went on. Look here! This creature is called a cephalopod. It had legs attached to its head. Here are the cronids. They stayed in one place like the anemones. Some built rings out of stone of the salts in the seawater. These rings held soft jelly-like bodies. With feathery parts, they moved in the water and they could catch tiny creatures floating about in the sea. Because they were so colorful and looked like flowers, they were called sea lilies. But they were animals, not plants. When they died, the stalk of the rings collapsed and fell to the bottom of the sea. The waters were full of life at this time. Here we have the Silurian period. During this time, we also had swamp plants. These kept their feet in the water, but they popped their heads out to see what was beyond the water. Here is the Devonian period. There were creatures of long ago who, instead of eating other creatures, made their own food out of sunlight and the salts in the water. As they drifted around, they thought, I wonder what it would be like over there on the land. And so they drifted over to the edge of the sea. The waves and tides caught some and washed them onto the land. They stayed there until the water caught them again and washed them back into the sea. The day came, however, when some said, Oh, it is lovely here. They stayed on the land because they had plenty of sunshine and air, which contained a gas called carbon dioxide that they needed to make food. They attached themselves to the land, from which they could get water and mineral salts. For the first time, plants appeared on the land. When they died, they left their bodies there, preparing the ground for other life forms to come. Life was now moving onto the land. While the plants were trying out the land, two new kinds of creatures appeared. One of these was the coral polyp, which helped to build up the land by eating the salts in the seas. The other was an animal that had a hard rod inside its body. Up until now, the hard part was always outside the body. This was the beginning of animals with backbones. This animal eventually developed into the fish, but these fish were different from those we have today. They were enormous fish with hard plates on the outside to protect themselves. Here is the armored jawless fish. They buried themselves in the bottom of the sea with only hard plates sticking out and waited until a bit of dinner floated by. And then they would open up their mouths and eat. Some could swim very swiftly, and they developed movable fins, which helped them swim even better. Places that were in the sea became land, and places that had no rain dried out. Some fish were cut off from the water. Imagine being a creature in one of these places. You need water so that you can live, but the water dries up. Fish had to change or die. So they decided to build a sack inside their body with water in it so that when there was no water, they could still breathe. And so the secret of breathing outside the water was invented. The kingdom of amphibians, animals who live partly in the water, began. Now, here's the Carboniferous amphibians. Fins were of no use anymore, so they changed and became legs to walk on. Something very wonderful happened when the amphibians came. The sound of the first voice on land. Up until the amphibians came with their voices, the silence was broken only by the sound of rain against the rocks, or by the rumble of thunder. Imagine how exciting it would have been to hear the first voice ever to be made on the land. Meanwhile, the plants had left the sea. They grew in great variety and size, eating and making their own food with the air and sunlight, eating and growing in great variety and size. The insects also came. So there was food around for the amphibians. They had a great time, except for one little problem. Because of the way their skins were formed, the amphibians needed to be near the water to keep their skins from drying out. Some wanted to be free of the water. They wanted to be independent and to be able to travel. They wanted to be able to eat the plants that grew farther from the water. But how? They thought and thought. They would have to leave the water. So, gradually, they developed a special kind of skin that did not dry out, and for their eggs, they invented a shell. Now there was no problem. These were the reptiles. They had a skin that could be in the sun and shells for their eggs so they would not dry out. Now they could move wherever they wished across the land. And then what happened? The reptiles had a good time, and they grew and grew. Many experiments were tried. There was no one to stop these creatures, and they became the lords and masters of the world. They took over the land and the seas, and they even took control of the air. Some of the dinosaurs were the largest land animals that ever existed. Can you imagine how the earth must have shaken as these huge creatures moved from place to place, feeding? These animals had everything they wanted. The little animals had no chance against these big animals, and so the smaller animals fled to where it was cold, where the large reptile-like animals could not live and could not get to them. As time went on, these animals, who lived on the fringes where it was cold, developed something to protect themselves from the cold. They developed hair or fur and a way to keep their blood warm without sunlight. These were the first birds and the mammals. What about their eggs? They knew very well what happened to the eggs that were left alone, so some began to carry them inside their bodies. The birds, however, could not carry their eggs and fly, so they built nests for their eggs. One of the birds always stayed with the eggs until the babies were hatched, and they fed them until they were big enough to leave the nest. The mammals kept their eggs inside them, and when the babies were born, they fed them with their own milk. This was very new. No other animal ever did this before. The young ones had to look after themselves, but the children of the birds and mammals remained with the parents until they could take care of themselves. The weather began to change again. It began to get colder and colder. The dinosaurs disappeared, although no one is really sure why this happened. Then the mammals took over. They grew and grew. They were able to go everywhere. There were giant animals, giant pigs, giant hippopotami, and giant elephants. The mammals had a good time. Even as it got colder, the huge sheets of ice covered much of the earth. The mammals moved all over the earth in search of food and warmer weather. In the end, none of the giant mammals were able to survive. Something very exciting happened towards the end of a very cold period. A completely new kind of creature emerged. It did not have sharp teeth to eat with, nor huge claws to fight with, nor fur. But it had something that none of the others had. It had a larger brain, and it had the power to think and imagine. This creature also had an enormous amount of love. It was different from the other animals because this animal could go beyond the love of its own children. It could love others, even others it would never see. This creature was the human being. You see, it was as if all this had to happen in order for man to come. Human beings would not have found it possible to live if they had come during the Cambrian period or the Silurian period. At the end, though, everything was ready. If the earth had a voice, it would say, I have spread myself thick with carpets of grass for your feet, so you can walk on soft ground. I have put flowers in my hair and covered myself with jewels for your pleasure. My cupboards are full of milk, meats, fruits, and vegetables for you to eat. Down in the cellars are coal and iron. All of me is ready. It is time for you human beings to come. And so we are here. This was all prepared for us, and now we are part of the story. There is a great deal more to tell about the life on our planet, but that is a story for another day.